All right. On-chain resource markets. Not exactly the most captivating topic at first glance, right? But these sources you sent over about this FOIL protocol, well, they've got me kind of hooked, to be honest.
Yeah, it's a problem that's been flying under the radar for a while. These unpredictable costs for gas fees, blob space. It's a real headache for developers trying to, build stuff on the blockchain.
For sure. If you want users to actually use your dApp, you can't have them hit with some crazy gas fee out of nowhere.
Yeah.
It's just not a good user experience.
And that's what FOIL is tackling, trying to create more stability so developers can offer, predictable pricing.
Okay, so stable pricing. Got it. But the sources keep saying everything on chain. That's a pretty broad claim. Where are they even starting with all this?
Well, they're starting with gas fees on Ethereum, which is kind of the most obvious pain point, right?
Yeah, gas fees are notorious for being all over the place.
Exactly. 1 minute it's a few bucks, the next minute it's like you're buying a used car just to make a transaction.
Ugh, tell me about it. So less roller coaster, more smooth sailing when it comes to gas prices. Is that what FOIL's going for?
Exactly.
How do they actually do that? The stuff about their implementation on Ethereum L1. It all sounded pretty complicated.
Yeah, there are some moving parts for sure, but the basic idea, it's actually pretty clever. They're using these expiring contracts and tapping into Uniswap liquidity pools to create kind of a prediction market for gas prices.
Hold on. Are you telling me I could basically lock in a future gas price today?
That's the gist of it, yeah.
That's kind of brilliant. Why hasn't anyone done this before?
Well, it's a pretty novel approach, and there are these virtual tokens involved, too. VGAS and VGWEI, they basically represent bets on whether the gas price will go up or down. And then there's a whole smart contract system that manages everything. It's all very DeFi.
Okay, my inner DeFi nerd is definitely intrigued. But let's back up for a second. How does this actually benefit both sides, the people providing the gas and the people who need it?
Okay, so let's say you're running a big exchange. Tons of transactions happening all the time. You need a lot of gas. And if the price suddenly spikes, well, that could really mess with your budget.
Oh, yeah, that'd be a nightmare for sure.
With FOIL, you can go to the marketplace, see the available VGAS, and basically prepay for your gas at a price you're comfortable with.
It's like locking in a good deal on gas, even if the market goes crazy later on.
Exactly.
That's pretty slick. I can see how that would be huge for anyone doing serious business on Ethereum.
Totally. And on the other side, let's say you're someone who wants to provide liquidity to the market. So you deposit, 100 ETH as collateral. You could sell VGAS tokens, basically betting that the gas price will stay below a certain level. If you're right, you profit. If you're wrong, well, you might lose some ETH.
So it's all about managing risk. Both sides get more predictability. Makes a lot of sense. But you mentioned something earlier about scaling challenges on L1. What's the issue there?
Well, it's kind of ironic, actually. EIP 1559, which was supposed to help with gas fees, it actually created a bit of a problem for this whole idea of an L1 gas market.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, with EIP 1559, the base fee gets burned, so validators don't actually get that money anymore. They rely more on those priority tips, which are, much less predictable.
So it's harder for them to provide consistent liquidity for a gas market.
Right, because their income is more volatile.
Okay, so this change that was supposed to be good actually made things a bit trickier.
Yeah, it's kind of a catch-22.
Fascinating. So is that where FOIL's Layer 2 solutions come in?
Precisely.
Okay, I'm all ears.
So instead of just relying on ETH for collateral, FOIL uses these NFTs that represent future fee revenue on Layer 2.
NFTs as collateral. That's a new one.
Right. It's pretty innovative. And they've got two main implementations they're proposing. One involves this automated liquidity pool that uses those NFTs to keep things running smoothly. The other one, it's more about governance-triggered auctions, where big players can buy gas directly from the fee collectors using those NFTs.
So two different approaches, but both aimed at bringing more stability and liquidity to those L2 gas markets.
Exactly.
This is getting pretty deep into DeFi territory. I can see how this would be really appealing to, the hardcore crypto folks. But what about the average user or developer who maybe isn't as familiar with all this stuff?
Well, that's where FOIL's token vaults come in.
Token vaults?
Yeah. They've created these tokenized shares that represent ownership in passive liquidity vaults.
Okay, so if I'm hearing you correctly, it's kind of like investing in a fund. You don't have to actively manage anything. You just hold the tokens and earn passive income.
Exactly.
So even if I'm not a DeFi expert, I can still participate in this whole system and potentially benefit from it.
That's the idea.
This is really interesting stuff. I'm starting to see the big picture here. But
yeah.
I have to ask, with all this talk about price discovery and settlement, how do we know that the final price for these gas markets is actually accurate and trustworthy?
That's a great question, and that's where UMA comes in.
UMA.
It stands for Universal Market Access. But the key thing to know is that they provide something called an optimistic oracle.
An optimistic oracle. Okay, you're going to have to break that one down for me.
Sure, basically. It acts as kind of a safety net for the whole system, making sure that the settlement price is accurate and fair. There's a whole process for proposing a price, challenging it if someone thinks it's wrong, and ultimately making sure that we end up with a fair outcome.
So UMA is like the referee for this whole gas market thing.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Keeping everything honest.
Exactly.
This has been really eye-opening. We've covered a lot of ground here. But before we wrap up this first part, I'm curious, how does all of this fit into the bigger picture of on-chain resource markets? We've talked a lot about gas.
Yep.
But you mentioned earlier that foil has broader applications?
Oh, absolutely. And that's what we'll get into in the next part. There's a whole world of on-chain resources out there that could benefit from this kind of approach.
Can't wait to hear more.
Stay tuned. You're right to be thinking bigger picture here. Gas is just one piece of the puzzle. There are all sorts of on-chain resources that could benefit from this kind of, stable pricing model.
Yeah, like blob space. That one keeps popping up in the sources. And honestly, it sounds kind of sci-fi to me.
It kind of is. It's a pretty new way of handling data on blockchains, like Ethereum, Celestia, Eigenda. Think of it like attaching external hard drives to the blockchain.
Okay, I'm picturing a blockchain with a bunch of USB drives sticking out of it.
Yeah, something like that. These blobs, they can hold tons of data, way more than you could fit on the blockchain itself, and that keeps things from getting too congested and expensive.
So instead of trying to cram everything onto the blockchain, we're attaching these massive data packages to it.
Exactly.
Makes sense, especially with all these data-heavy applications being built.
Right. Think about decentralized video streaming. Huge NFTs. Even entire virtual worlds. All of that data needs a place to live, and blob space is a big part of the solution.
Wow. Okay, so we're not just talking about storing cat pictures anymore. We're talking about, like, entire virtual universes.
Exactly.
My mind is officially blown.
Good.
But how does Foil's approach translate to these blob space markets? I mean, it seems like a very different beast than gas fees.
The core idea is the same, though. Connect the people who have extra blob space with the people who need it. Create a marketplace where supply and demand can set a stable price.
So just like with gas, developers could lock in a price for blob space and not have to worry about the cost suddenly skyrocketing. That would be huge, especially for those projects that are really data intensive.
And what's really interesting is that we're seeing a shift in how people are using these resources.
Yeah.
It's not just individuals or small projects anymore. Big companies and institutions are getting involved, and they have massive data needs.
So we're moving from like sporadic usage to something more like industrial scale demand.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
This is getting serious.
It is. We're talking about a future where on-chain resource markets could be even bigger than traditional cloud computing.
Wow. That's a bold statement.
But I think it's entirely possible, and that's why solutions like Foil are so important. They provide the infrastructure for a more stable and predictable on-chain economy.
Foil is building the plumbing for this new digital world.
I like that analogy.
Laying the groundwork so all these crazy new applications can actually be built.
Exactly.
This is all incredibly exciting. But I have to ask, how does Foil plan to sustain itself? What's their business model?
The million-dollar question. And that's what we'll dive into in the next part.
Can wait. Okay, so we've dug into the tech behind Foil, explored this wild concept of blob space, and even touched on those tokenized shares. But let's talk business. How does Foil actually make money? How do they plan to, keep the lights on?
Right. Building something revolutionary is one thing, but it's got to be sustainable, right?
Exactly.
Now, the sources you provided, they didn't get into all the nitty-gritty details of their financial model.
Okay.
But we can make some educated guesses based on what we know.
All right, let's put on our detective hats then. What do you think is going on?
Well, remember those tokenized shares? The ones that represent ownership in Foil's liquidity vaults?
Yeah.
Those are probably going to be a key part of their revenue strategy. Foil could take a small fee on the yield generated within those vaults, kind of like a management fee.
Makes sense. It's like pretty standard for investment funds, right?
Exactly. And considering the potential scale of these on-chain resource markets, even a tiny fee on a massive pool of liquidity could generate a lot of revenue for Foil.
Especially with Like all these institutions jumping in and the demand for blob space going through the roof,
Yeah.
but is just making money the only goal. I mean, Foil seems pretty big on the whole decentralization thing, right? Community ownership, governance, all that.
Absolutely.
So how does that fit in?
Well, Foil could issue a governance token,
Okay.
letting holders have a say in how the protocol develops.
So it's like the users actually have a voice.
Exactly. It's the true spirit of decentralization. Instead of a small group making all the decisions, the future of Foil could be guided by a whole community of users.
I like it. It's like we've seen it work well with other DeFi projects, right?
Yeah, definitely a promising path for Foil.
Okay, so it sounds like Foil's on the right track, balancing a sustainable business model with empowering a decentralized community. But, got to play devil's advocate here for a second. Are there any potential risks, roadblocks?
Ugh, always got to think critically, right?
Of course.
And yeah, there are always challenges when you're trying to do something new.
Like what?
Well, for one, regulatory uncertainty. Governments around the world are still figuring out how to deal with crypto and DeFi.
Right.
Foil's going to have to navigate that carefully.
For sure. What about competition? Are there other projects out there trying to do something similar?
There always are, right? This space moves fast.
Yeah, it's crazy.
But Foil's got some things going for it. That modular architecture, the ability to handle multiple resources, not just gas, and its commitment to community governance.
It sounds like they're in a pretty good position.
I'd say so.
Well, this has been a truly fascinating deep dive. I mean, who knew on-chain resource markets could be so interesting?
Right. We went from gas fees to blob space to tokenomics all in one go.
My brain's a little fried, but in a good way. Before we sign off, any final thoughts for our listeners? Something to chew on as they explore this space.
Here's a question. As the demand for stable on-chain resources keeps growing, who will become the major players? Will it be institutions? Decentralized communities? Some kind of hybrid? The answer will shape the future of blockchain and the decentralized web as a whole.
That's a great question. A lot to think about there. Well, everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring, and we'll catch you next time.